This event on whether America's foreign policy is compatible with Christian ethics is brought to you by the Center for the Study of Statesmanship and Institute for Human Ecology. And the intention of the event is to delve into an area often neglected in discussions of foreign policy. Not questions of prudence and strategy, but questions of what's right and wrong. And especially what's right and wrong in the context of Christian ethics and the Christian tradition of thinking about war, diplomacy, and international relations. And we've got really some of the best people possible here to have this discussion. We have Mike Desch. Professor Desch is the founding director of the Notre Dame International Security Center and the Packy J.D. Professor of Political Science at Notre Dame. He's published in a number of prestigious academic and popular journals, most recently with an exchange in Commonweal magazine about the Catholic Church's position on nuclear weapons. And next to him is Dr. Paul Miller, who's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and currently serving in the AEI Initiative on Faith and Public Life's 2019 and 2020 visiting professor. If you like what you hear, Paul is teaching a course on Christianity, national identity, and America's role in the world at the AEI Summer Institute for undergraduates. Applications due February 24th. And our moderator for tonight is Tim Carney. Tim is a resident fellow at AEI, where he works on economic competition, cronyism, civil society, localism, and religion in America. He's also a columnist at the Washington Examiner, and he has a recent book out on alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. We're very lucky to have Professors Miller and Desch here. Very grateful to have you guys as a crowd here. And if you heard from my introduction, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I am a Catholic who cares about foreign policy, so I'm here to interview these guys. I spent most of the night trying to work on just the right sort of, with a Georgetown professor, a Notre Dame professor, just the right Jesuit joke. I couldn't get any cleared by my priest, so I'm not gonna start with that. But yes, it's exactly right that Christian ethics, Catholic teaching, the words of the Bible, the words of Jesus, have a lot to do with the United States' role in the world, with war, with peace, with our duty to our neighbors. Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. He very explicitly said, my peace I leave you. Very explicitly made it clear that our duty to other people is not just to those in our country, but to those around the world. So it's not an easy question, which is why we're very lucky to have these two scholars here tonight. So the sort of first question I have to both of you is, Christian ethics, what does it tell us about what the United States ought to be doing and is doing on foreign policy? And we're going to start with Professor Paul.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. Thanks to John. Thanks to all you organizers, to Catholic University. Thank you to you all for your time and giving us your time and attention. And I hope we make it worth your while tonight. Christian ethics and American foreign policy. It's a great subject. I've been trying to think and write about this for a long time. When I looked at tonight's event, Mike and I have not actually met each other before tonight, but I did some research, and I just want to say thank you to John for finding two people who really don't agree on anything. So this is going to be a great conversation in contrasts. I'll start with the one thing that perhaps we do agree on, and that is, I think this. Christian political ethics begins with the idea that governments have a moral duty to seek the safety and the well-being of their citizens. I think it's a true statement. I presume we probably agree on that. Where we go from there is where things get interesting. It's where you try to apply that and say, how do you go about securing the safety and the well-being of your citizens? Let me begin with a sort of a reflection on Reinhold Niebuhr, right, the patron saint of Christian realism. Reinhold Niebuhr is a favorite from sort of all sides of the aisle. Everybody loves to cite him and quote him. Barack Obama said Niebuhr was his favorite philosopher, and John McCain also quoted Niebuhr in favor of the Iraq War. So you can find Niebuhr to support everything. Here's what I found in Niebuhr. He was talking about the nature of realism and contrasting realism with Christian realism. And in an essay called Augustine's Political Realism, he contrasted his approach with, he called the realism, in quotes he put it, the realism of those who are myopically realistic, short-sightedly realistic. by seeing only their own interests and failing thereby to do justice to the interests where they are involved with the interests of others. Right, so Niebuhr was saying, channeling Augustine, that sometimes our interests are not simply ours, that our interests and other nations' interests are essentially the same, and we can't pursue the one without pursuing the other. And it behooves us to be cognizant of the ways in which our interests are intertwined with much of the rest of the world. He goes on and says this: a consistent self-interest, that is to say, narrow self-interest, on the part of a nation will work against its interests. It'll be counterproductive, because it will fail to do justice to the broader and longer interests which are involved with the interests of other nations. So we have short-term, immediate interests. If we define our interests very narrowly, that's one thing. But if we pursue only that short-term stuff, we're going to miss out on the broader, long-term interests that involves the rest of the world. He says, a narrow national loyalty on our part will obscure our long-range interests when they're involved with those of the whole alliance of free nations. And so I agree with Niebuhr in this. I think that when we define our national interest, we should understand the ways in which our interests are the same as or overlap with much of the rest of the world, to the extent that we should pursue the good of the whole and not define our national interest very narrowly in a short-sighted, short-term way. Okay, what do I mean by this? What's the best way to kind of boil this down to brass tacks? Here's the bumper sticker. The liberal international order is an effective tool for pursuing the safety of our citizens, the well-being of our citizens. The liberal international order is an effective instrument for pursuing a just end, the safety of our and the well-being of our citizens. The liberal international order is the outer perimeter of American security. It is an engine of American prosperity. It's a tool of American influence. And as such, it is just and wise for us to use it and invest in it. I'd say the same thing for pretty much any other country in the world. It's wise and just for any country to invest in this order because it's founded in principle on fairness and equality among nations at its best. I know that we sometimes get that wrong, but in principle, it's founded on fairness. And therefore, a Christian realist political ethics should say that American foreign policy should revise, defend, upkeep, maintain, and use the liberal international order as a cornerstone of our grand strategy. And that means Christian political ethics suggests a strategy of deep engagement, of a fairly active foreign policy, a well-funded and well-staffed diplomatic corps, a large foreign aid budget, a network of alliances with countries that see the world the same way that we do, that we have overlapping interests with. And yes, it does mean, I think, a globally deployed military presence to deter rivals, reassure allies, invest in partnerships, train foreign militaries, provide disaster relief, and more. It is wise, it is just, it is ethically good, and it is strategically sound to do so. Now, I know that usually when I say this, I've been making this argument long enough, I know the rebuttal. The rebuttal is Iraq. Right? The rebuttal is Vietnam. Or sometimes the scholars say, this is just a cover for American empire, for liberal hegemony. So I'll save my rebuttal. I do have a rebuttal for that, but I don't want to take up all the time. I'll save that for after Mike makes the argument, and then I'll dive in with my rebuttal on that. I just say I'm not persuaded. I don't think it's imperialism. There is a difference between real imperialism and the kind of liberal order building that I'm talking about. I think I want to conclude with a couple of questions. Given what I've sketched here, and I know that you generally, I'm going to guess, disagree with most of what I've said, here's a couple of questions for you. I know that you've counseled retrenchment, or pulling back or exercising restraint. As I look at the data, I've found that we have already been doing that for about 30 years. The United States has a smaller presence around the world today, and a smaller military budget, a smaller intelligence and diplomatic budget and foreign aid budget than when the Cold War ended. The Iraq War was a pretty small, actually, sort of temporary blip, and we're back down again. So my question is, when do we stop retrenching? At what point is it enough, or can we stop retrenching now and kind of hold the line to take stock of where we are, given changes in the world environment? Second question would be about the democratic peace. If you didn't hear it, the democratic peace is very much there in how I understand the world and the liberal international order. I understand it to be essentially a true theory, and so I just ask, what about the democratic peace? Do you acknowledge that it's real? Is it a good, useful tool for policymaking, as I think it is? And my third question is...
I thought it was two questions.
One last one. I'm done. Yeah.
Please.
Third question. given the record of the past 75 years of liberal order building, past 75 years of great power peace, of unprecedented prosperity, and I'd even say of the expansion of freedom around the world, not just in the West, not just in America. What's wrong with this? How can you counsel that we divest from this project? And what is the alternative that offers a superior version of justice than what we have today?
Thank you.
Yep.
Great, Paul. Those are terrific questions, which I'm not going to answer. At least because I thought I got an opening statement. I mean, is the rule of law completely eroded?
We still have a rule of law in America.
Yeah, let me, but we will come back to them because they're terrific questions. I have a question for you, but I'm going to wait and do it at the end. So I want to, the question I posed for myself is whether realism and restraint are compatible with Christian ethics. And the Christian ethics I care most about are Roman Catholic ethics. So I'm going to focus on just war theory. And I want to make 2 points. First of all, I think, with all due respect to my colleague, the practical case for restraint is open and shut. And it's not just Iraq, although Iraq is a big part of it, but just talk about the past 20 years of U.S. foreign policy. Afghanistan, which I supported the initial intervention after 9/11, classic example of a good war gone bad. A war that was justified given the Taliban's harboring of al-Qaeda and the necessity of dealing with al-Qaeda militarily. But somewhere along the road to Kabul, we went from taking care of that limited and focused problem to nation building. Nation building in a nation that had never been a nation at any point in history. Iraq, Paul, I can't believe you're going to defend Iraq.
Oh, I'm not.
I mean, we went in on the belief that Saddam Hussein was pursuing a weaponized nuclear program. The evidence is overwhelming that he was not. The only interesting question is why he didn't fully come clean about that. We went in also on the insinuation that the Iraqi regime had meaningful connections before the invasion with al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda became a real big problem, and subsequently ISIS after the invasion, but not before. The big winner of our toppling of Saddam Hussein was the Islamic Republic of Iran. And if you believe, as I do, that maintaining a balance of power in the Persian Gulf is in the interest of the region and in the United States, absolutely the last thing you would have done would be to knock over a key check on Iranian or on Iraqi or Iranian influence in the region. But finally, and most importantly, the human cost of our operation in Iraq, not so much for the United States, although the fact that over 5,000 American men and women in uniform gave their lives in a war that I think ultimately was misbegotten is a national tragedy. But the human cost on the people that we went in to liberate has been astronomical. Libya. The real Hillary Clinton scandal in Libya is not Benghazi. The real scandal was her belief initially that we could social engineer the Arab Spring in Libya and turn that country into a democracy basically on the end of a bayonet. And then finally, Syria. And Syria was the case I expected you to push harder. But it seems to me, even in Syria, the only thing worse than the Bashar al-Assad regime, which is an odious regime, no doubt about it, is what was highly likely to follow him if he was overthrown. So I think the practical case for restraint is easy to make. The hard case, and the one that I've come here to the godly precincts of Catholic University from maybe the less godly precincts of Notre Dame, but certainly the more godly precincts than Georgetown.
Granted, we agree.
And I say that.
We have the ranking agreed to.
And I say that as somebody who was Jesuit educated at the late 70s, early 1980s. So I know Jesuit education pretty well. But the argument that restraint and realpolitik is compatible with the Roman Catholic tradition of thinking about war and peace, I think is a harder sell. And I see the sisters out there, they're already sharpening the knives. And they'll tell us, quite rightly, that
Nobody has sharper knives than the sisters.
Exactly. When they got on the bus and came out to South Bend, I took notice. Since Vatican II, the Church has veered toward a position, at least in terms of war and peace issues, that's increasingly pacifistic. And indeed, even before that, in the 20th century, that was the Church, the direction the Church was going. Think about Pope Benedict XV and World War I. Or think later in the early Cold War period, the founding fathers of what would become the European Union, people like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Gasperi, were all animated by a deeply Catholically infused vision of international politics that seeks to overturn the world of realpolitik that I'm advocating for. Now, my argument. Restraint, which Paul and I are going to argue about, is deeply infused with realism and realpolitik. Our genesis story is Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And the classics illustrated one-line summary of that is Pericles, the great Athenian leader, was an advocate of restraint. His successors, especially Alcibiades, were ambitious proponents of an aggressive foreign policy. The Sicilian expedition is basically the low point of the story. So what realism basically says is four things. First of all, it's interest that defines how states interact with each other in the international system. Power is the key interest that states have, and very few areas of the world directly affect the balance of power. Secondly, we believe that states in anarchy, in an disordered international system, find it to be in their own interest most of the time to take care of their own security. Sometimes we need to help them, but most often what we need to do is avoid the moral hazard of doing too much, which produces instances in which allies don't provide sufficiently for their own security. Third premise is the most powerful ism in international politics from the realist view is nationalism. And nationalism, the idea that particular forms of social organization dominate the world, teaches a powerful lesson, which is anytime you intervene in another country, you're going to run up against it. The final presumption is a healthy respect for the limits of even great power. And the United States, since the end of the Cold War, has been one of the greatest powers history has ever seen. But even a power of that magnitude is incapable of basically socially engineering the world. More importantly, there's a domestic cost to bestriding the world like a colossus. Lord Acton once famously said that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think a lot of the story of the past 25 or 30 years or so is not just going to be told in terms of our misadventures abroad, but also what our imperial stance has done to our republic here at home. So just very quickly, and I'm getting the hairy eyeball here, how could this view of the world be at all compatible with Roman Catholicism? And I've already said that Vatican II seems to fit uncomfortably with the Christian realist view that I've tried to lay out. But if you want to see a really full-throated attack on this enterprise, go back and read the French philosopher Jacques Maritain's famous essay, The End of Machiavellianism. And if we were to, raise the spirit of Maritain here, he would say two things. He'd say, Professor Desch, your realism will lead leaders to do evil, and it'll produce bad policy for your state. And I'd make the argument, and I'll unpack this in more detail in the Q&A, that I think the experience of the past 25 to 30 years have suggested precisely the opposite. That, in fact, a restrained foreign policy has led to a better foreign policy for the United States, defined in narrow secular terms. But I also think that it's also, in thinking about interest defined as power, ironically not led leaders to engage in the sort of evil that absolute Machiavellianism would bring about. So I said I would wrap up with one question for Paul. And the question is, why do you grasp the realist mantle at all? It seems to me a liberal internationalist argument is compatible with certain parts of the tradition, at least, of the Catholic view of international politics, and also has its own deep roots in American political culture. But why did you feel the need to tie what strikes me as a classically big L liberal argument to realism? So with that.
You can answer either the question he just asked or whatever you think is the most interesting thing.
So I can just say whatever I want to now. That's great. I feel like a candidate stumping,
Yeah.
Answer the question I wish you asked. I think I will probably go ahead and take up your question there.
And I'll take up yours too at some point.
Yeah.
Just tell me when.
Why claim the mantle realism at all? Partly because I do think that my argument is actually empirically grounded. I think I'm actually paying attention to the facts. Facts like the democratic peace, which is, I think, very empirically grounded, and based on that, it leads me to think of alliances a certain way and investing in relationships a certain way, and upholding NATO, for example. But it's also because I want to recognize the importance of drawing limits. Oftentimes when you hear an internationalist argument like mine, it is framed in universalistic, utopian terms, and it sounds as if the person is saying we ought to go and conquer the world in the name of saving it. And I recognize that's a bad thing, and we shouldn't do that. Realism, as I've packaged it here, helps us draw lines and know when and where to invest around the world. We should be cautious. We should be prudential. We should be realistic in how we try to go about our liberal order building. I do think it's a worthwhile project. I think it's realistic because, by the way, for 70 years we've been doing it with some success. So that says it's possible, and therefore we should keep on trying to do it and just do it better. There's nothing unrealistic about the liberal international order. It already exists. So let's just upkeep it and improve it where we can.
So your first question to me, which I thought was eminently fair one, which is basically words to the effect of how much retrenchment would you accept? And I'll turn that question around on you, Paul, and say, I've given you a list of many of the greatest hits of the new millennium in terms of wars, and made my judgment on those. What's your judgment on them? And is there a war that we fought in that time period that, in retrospect, you thought was a mistake?
Yeah, thank you. So I look forward to your answer to my question at some point. So I am not at all going to sit here and defend the record of the U.S. foreign policy in the last 25 or 30 years. There's plenty that has gone wrong, and we actually may agree quite a bit on the critiques of American foreign policy. We're going to disagree on what exactly went wrong, but yeah, it's fairly plain the war in Iraq was wrong. Full disclosure, I did support it at the time. I've written a case study of it in my next book on just war theory, and have concluded that while I think the initial cause was morally permissible, it was ultimately obviously a failure, but also unjust in execution. So plenty has gone wrong with American foreign policy in the last 30 years. I think the main problem isn't too much liberalism. In fact, I think it's probably too little. I think we've failed mainly in not living up to our liberal ideals. And sometimes the failure has been a failure of engagement. We just haven't dedicated enough resources or effort or attention to actually make the things happen which we say we want to happen. You brought up Syria. I think Syria is a great case study of restraint. This is what happens when America does not get involved. We've barely done anything in Syria, and it has built state failure and a terrorist recruiting ground. So that's a good case of what restraint, I think, leads to in some cases, not always, but in some cases.
I want to bring this back towards Christian ethics, Catholic teaching, and just ask what I hope is a difficult question here. We can look at the problems that arise from our war in Iraq, from our intervention in the Libyan civil war, and that we could imagine would happen if we deposed Bashar Assad. But we Catholics believe that there are sins of omission and sins of commission. And the Obama administration argument for the intervention in Libya was, we knew that they were going to go door to door, murdering the people who oppose Gaddafi's regime. And so we had an obligation to stop them. So when you're preaching restraint, are you preaching, let's leave Gaddafi and Saddam and Assad in power? And to what extent is there moral culpability for the evils and the murders that those dictators impose if we have the power to stop them from committing those murders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Although I'm sort of, I'm very curious about the particular tradition of Roman Catholic thought where the argument of what's basically in the secular version R2P, the responsibility to protect, comes from. I guess...
Or in the words of Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility.
Oh, yeah. Although when responsibility became coterminous with profligate use is an interesting...
Go on about the responsibility to protect.
Yeah, I think there are lots of instances around the world where governments are doing horrible things to their own people. The 20th century was, unfortunately, the nadir in terms of that. But yet, did anybody... Well, some people did, I guess, early in the Cold War, who were advocates of preventive war against the Stalin Soviet Union, seriously think that a war to end the humanitarian crisis there made good sense. Was anybody arguing during the Mao period, another great mass murderer, that there was any reasonable scenario in which the United States would intervene and stop that? But more importantly, let's look at cases where we have intervened and where things have not gone very well. And I think Libya is a good case of that. I think Iraq is an even better case. The human cost, we don't really know for sure the full cost of the war in Iraq, and certainly not all of the Iraqis who died as a result of American military operations. I'm certainly not insinuating that we went in there with a callous disregard for the lives of the Iraqis. But nonetheless, you can't conduct modern military operations in a surgical way, particularly given the way the war in Iraq turned out. It's like the old line in Vietnam about the major saying, in order to save the village, we had to destroy it. In order to save Iraq, we killed lots of people. The moral economy of restraint, it seems to me, comes precisely from the possibility that in a lot of cases where you use military force, you can't predict how it's going to turn out, but you can predict that lots of innocent people are going to get killed.
Paul?
So yeah, let's talk about Iraq. Iraq was a mistake, right? It was an imprudent, wrong use of force. But I don't think Iraq was a paradigmatic case of U.S. foreign policy. I think right now, almost all of us, are falling prey to recency bias, where the most recent data point is seen to be the most important data point. And because Iraq looms so large in our consciousness, we have a tendency to look around the world and look in history and look in the future and just see Iraq-like problems all over the place. I think that's actually what afflicted the Obama administration, and it's why they did not intervene in Syria. They've said it actually very plainly, it was because of Iraq. And I think it was faulty thinking. I may actually agree with the decision not to intervene there, but it was faulty thinking about why they did what they did. Were you about to say something?
Well, at some point, I would love to hear you articulate a plausible strategy in which, through American intervention in Syria, that we both got rid of the Assad regime, but we did not bring to power groups that would have been as bad, if not worse. And
You weren't suggesting.
No, I was.
You were just saying,
yeah.
Even if it's the right conclusion, it was faulty.
Faulty thinking,
Yes.
yeah. Better example would be Afghanistan. I think the faulty thinking about Iraq led to bad strategy in Afghanistan as well. I don't advocate an intervention in Syria, to be very clear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I'm relieved.
Yeah. I'll get back around to that. Again, Iraq, not a paradigmatic case of U.S. foreign policy. Most of what we do in the world and most of what liberal order building involves isn't invading other countries and forcing them to be democratic. Most of what deep engagement would involve is a more active foreign policy that involves things like all the normal tools of statecraft, more aid, more trade, more development, more trained diplomats, more language training, just a more active presence in the world. This is the sinews of diplomacy. This is the normal wheels of statecraft churning. And you need to know, we've been cutting back on that for 30 years. Our diplomats, our State Department, our USAID are starved for money and for talented people. They need more of it, and we've been cutting back and retrenching consistently. If you're wondering why we do such a bad job in places like Libya and Syria, and not just there, but Somalia and Yemen, and take your pick, it's because for 30 years we've been divesting ourselves of the tools required to actually do something meaningful there. Our foreign aid budget is, I think it might be down to 1/10 of 1% of GDP. It's unbelievable how small it is compared to the Marshall Plan, which is about 2% of GDP. We have unilaterally disarmed ourselves of one of the most effective tools of statecraft. That's what retrenchment really looks like. We've decided not to spend the money on doing those kinds of things.
Okay, now that I don't think I can let pass. I, by the way, agree with you on the substantive issue. I believe in international engagement. I like diplomacy, and unlike many people in the Midwest, I even like foreign aid. But as a percentage of the amount of money that the Department of Defense has spent, foreign aid and these other international programs have gone way down. And we're spending, this year, we're on track to spend $750 billion on defense. Why isn't reducing defense spending to fund some of these other programs? My old boss, Bob Gates, famously did a handshake deal with Secretary of State Clinton to give her $200 million basically out of the change between the cushions on the sofa in his office in the E-ring. I mean, what sort of world do we live in? And you're telling me that the problem is retrenchment? The problem isn't retrenchment, because we haven't retrenched in terms of the big ticket items, in terms of the federal international budget, which is defense spending. So I'd love to take some of that money and spend it on AID, spend it on state, maybe spend more on the intelligence community. I just don't think we need to spend as much on the military as we do.
Are we retrenching? Yeah.
In hard power, yeah. So we absolutely have. So the trend line for both military and civilian budgets is going down. Civilian is going down faster, right? So they've both been going down quite a bit since 1988, right? Since the peak of the Cold War. The United States, since the end of the Cold War, cut about its military budget by about a third, reduced its armed forces by about a third, almost completely eliminated things like public diplomacy, foreign aid, reduced its intelligence budget quite a bit, withdrew 3/4 of its troops from Europe, about half of its troops from East Asia, decommissioned 3/4 of its nuclear weapons, unilaterally disarmed ourselves, destroyed our own chemical weapons stockpile. So we have consistently reduced our own hard power over the past 30 years. And again, the Iraq War was a fairly temporary and minor blip up, and then it's back down again. So we have significantly withdrawn our hard power. Now, you said, could we not take some of that and give it to development aid? My view is they both need more. We need more in both. I don't know quite what the magic number is.
Let me ask you why we need more. Unless I missed it, between 1989 and 1993, the Cold War ended. We basically came out on top, and the Soviet Union fell apart. Is it your proposition that there should not have been any drawdown in either the amount of money we were spending on forces or their deployment overseas? We won.
What I observe is that during the 1990s, I mean, are you happy with how the United States performed around the world after that drawdown? It sounded like you were pretty critical of the performance of U.S. foreign policy. So I think we would have done better if we had not cut back so much. I'll also say, right now, the defense budget, although you cited a very large figure, is the smallest as a percentage of GDP since 1939. The United States has the smallest military establishment it's had as a proportion of its economy since before World War II, and the smallest military footprint around the world since we sent troops to Africa in 1941. So that's where we are now. That's what retrenchment looks like. Now you're saying, do we need more? Well, I look at the behavior of Russia, I look at the behavior of China, North Korea, and Iran, and I say, okay, maybe the Cold War ended, but we are now in an era of great power rivalry with nuclear-armed states and terrorists, slavers, drug cartels, organized crime, and so forth. So yes, I think we need more tools to combat all of this array of enemies.
So there's a famous illustration that many people suggest to put in context how militarily dominant the United States is. And I'm not sure as of 2020 exactly what the numbers are, but I believe that the United States spends more than at least the next 15 countries around the world on military forces. And that if you were to add up just the raw numbers, the beans, that we would have, except maybe in military manpower, larger forces than certainly all of our potential peer competitors. And that's not at all talking about the qualitative advantage that the United States has over many of these other countries. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a realist, and I think that we may be moving back into a more multipolar world in which great power competition once again becomes a factor of international politics. But if you're asking me to bet on China or Russia, and I'm not even going to talk about Iran or North Korea, these are pygmies, in terms of who has the most effective military force in the world, every day and twice on Sunday, it's the United States. So this image that we've retrenched just doesn't accord with the reality of the world that we live in, which is the post-Cold War world, and also what other countries have done. You want to talk about retrenchment, talk about what the Russia did, from the early 1990s until relatively recently. They went.
So can you just address the military, and I'll throw in one more, and then I'm going to want to move away from the retrenchment, but I want you to defend that. The other is, before 9/11, we had over 1 million U.S. troops deployed outside of the United States. So
In the 80s we did, not in 19... Yeah.
So did we really retrench, considering that our military is spending more than at least the next 10 countries combined on defense spending?
So again, just looking at the trend lines of the actual dollar spent, it's been going down, or as a percent of GDP, it's been going down. And in nominal terms, it was going down until 9/11, blipped up a little bit. So yeah, I do call that retrenchment. Now, why is the United States military so much bigger than all the other countries combined? It is because the U.S. military tries to do things that other militaries in the world generally don't try to do. Right? We try to posture ourselves to deter enemies in multiple theaters. Nobody else tries to do that. But we also do something else. Let me give you an example. There's something called Task Force 151. It's a naval task force off the coast of Somalia that fights pirates. So it didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. There was a big problem with Somali piracy. Anybody see the movie Captain Phillips? Right? That's where that came from. Lots of problems with Somali piracy. Now, who was going to take that on? Was it going to be the Somali Navy, the Saudi Navy, the Yemeni Navy, the Djibouti Navy? Well, no. They all waited around and didn't do anything until the United States essentially volunteered to organize a posse, like the Old West. And the deputy says, okay, you, come here, right? And so we organized a multilateral posse against piracy. Only we can do that because only we have the resources. It means we got to spend a whole lot of money on overhead, on logistics, intelligence, command and control, communications, and so forth, that nobody else has, and it costs a lot of money for us, but at the end of the day, it served the whole world. There's a whole lot less piracy off the coast of Somalia. That's a small example of why we have a larger military that costs more money than anybody else. We're trying to do more things that cost a lot of money and filling services that nobody else does.
This segues perfectly into what I wanted to ask, which is, doesn't the United States have a unique role to play? When you listen to what the popes have said about foreign policy, they always have a supranational view. In other words, Christianity was very explicitly something that was worldwide. And our history has always been to look at all of Christendom as something that's bigger than the nation state. And when I listen to the popes talk, you know that they wish that the United Nations was this force that could sort of be this global uniting force for good. United Nations is not a Christian entity, it's a corrupt entity. And so given that reality, isn't there a role for the United States to be the posse organizer? We're the good guys. You know that comedy skit where the guys with the skulls and crossbones are like, maybe we're the baddies? When we look around, it's like, yeah, we made mistakes, but maybe we're the good guys. Isn't it our job to be the posse organizers?
Well, it seems to me there are two issues here. The more concrete issue is whether, without U.S. leadership, these public goods won't get provided. And I think that there's plenty of evidence that because the United States provides various public goods, other countries under-provide what they should. I mean, this has been the story about NATO defense spending going well back into the 1950s.
Instead of worrying about welfare cheats, we should be worrying about Germany not spending enough on defense.
Now, the more difficult question, and you're trying to sort of paint me into a corner, Tim, and I'm not resisting going into this corner. I believe
it's a well-painted corner.
I believe America is a very good country, and I believe in American exceptionalism. But also, I don't believe that we're as good, at least in the eyes of a lot of other people, as we think we are. And what I learned from St. Augustine was to understand that even people with the best of intentions can sometimes do very bad things. And I worry a lot when we pat ourselves on the back and tell ourselves how good we are, whether in fact we aren't guilty of the sin of pride. And I say that again, saying we're probably less guilty of it than a lot of other great powers in the past, but nonetheless, it's a reality. And a reality I think that those of us coming from a Christian frame ought to be sensitive to.
Yep, I agree, and I think that's actually one of the better arguments for why we should seek to bind our power within a liberal order framework. Because without liberal order, what will American power turn into? I think it probably will turn into an empire. Constraining our power within the norms of liberal order means that we're often going to be hypocritical and unfair, but at least we will have standards to hold us accountable and other people in the world to say, you're not being fair. And that will challenge us to do better and to try to restrain our power and use it for the common good.
So on the question of hypocritical, another Catholic idea is the problem of cooperation in evil. And whether it be we allied with Stalin during the Cold War, we had lots of unsavory friends. And sometimes the people who were pro-American, they were unsavory enough that we threw them overboard. Maybe that was a mistake. And then certainly in the war on terrorism, and currently Saudi Arabia is an ally. So I'm a journalist. We get to say these guys are bad and these guys are good. The U.S. government doesn't necessarily get to sort people that way. You need to have allies. So to what extent, how do you think about the cooperation in evil if we are supporting these governments, such as Saudi Arabia or Stalin or during the Cold War, the various allies we have? If we're Christians, are we more limited in the alliances we're able to make than if we're just realpolitik players trying to advance American interests? It's a harder question for you, so we'll start with you.
It's a harder question for me.
I think it is, yeah.
Well, I think it's a harder question not only for secular statesmen of goodwill, but also for the clergy. And think about the situation that the last interwar and wartime Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII faced in terms of dealing with the rise not only of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, but the ongoing threat of Stalin's Russia as well. And what would you say to Pius XII? Would you say that you need to take a strong stand against all these evil actors, even if it means that the Holy See would be overrun by the Nazis or the Italians? Or would you admit that there's a prudential element that even people of faith and moral concern can make a reasoned decision? I think I'm not a big fan of Winston Churchill, but I am a big fan of his famous line when he came under criticism in the Houses of Parliament for aligning with the Soviet Union after June of 1941, when he said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would have made at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. I mean, that's the reality of the world that we live in. And what I love about St. Augustine was that, he was, the effort to think about how Christians would navigate a world that would require those sorts of compromises while always keeping the eye on the prize. And the eye on the prize was not the perfection of the city of God on earth, but it was the achievement of the true city of God in heaven.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree. I think that alliances with autocratic powers are permissible under exceptional circumstances, but it should be exceptional, and you should review them regularly. I think the alliance with the Soviet Union was necessary. I think a lot of what we did in the Cold War probably wasn't. I think our relationship with Saudi Arabia today is sort of indefensible. I don't really support that at all. And I think we can see democratic powers as natural partners because we see the world in the same way. We have the same values. Partners, if not allies, we have formal alliances with many of them, but even democracies that aren't formal treaty partners, we can still see as just, there's a natural kinship there. So that's an easy map of the world right there. Sometimes we have to, but ally with autocratic powers, but it should be exceptional justification.
All right, now I'm going to throw in the wild card, and particularly because we have the tote bag there. Can you hold it up? It says, ban nuclear weapons. Now, this is not just one tote bag. This is basically what the Holy Father says. That previous popes have talked about nuclear warfare being immoral, but Pope Francis has said that nuclear deterrence and the possession of nuclear weapons is not fitting with Christian teaching. I want both of your responses on that. Paul first.
So, thank you. This is a great question, and one that I've sort of gone back and forth on over the years. I have written a book on just war theory. It's not out yet, but fingers crossed it'll be out late this year, early next year. So I've written about nuclear weapons, and I read a lot by Paul Ramsey, a Protestant theologian, mid-20th century, who wrote a lot on nuclear weapons. And I think I mostly agree with his conclusion, which was, I'll just state it as mine instead of trying to characterize him. Counterpopulation nuclear warfare is intrinsically immoral. It is a tool of genocide. It's absolutely evil.
Deliberately targeting
populations.
Non-military.
Yes, that's right.
targets.
Yeah. And so to the extent that is built into our nuclear doctrine or nuclear weapons, it's absolutely wicked and wrong. I will carve out a space for counter-force nuclear deterrence, where we are using our weapons to target other nuclear weapons or installations or large military formations, big tanks or aircraft carriers. I think those can be used, especially smaller nuclear weapons, can be used with proper discrimination and proportionality, and thereby pass the just war test.
So I was at the Vatican in November of 2017 when the Pope made his most explicit statement condemning nuclear deterrence. I guess as a believing Catholic, can you say you disagree with the Pope? I don't believe he spoke ex cathedra. So.
What we say is we prayerfully considered his comments.
I did.
I like being a Protestant.
Yeah, and so I wrote a piece that Commonweal, a sort of left of center journal of lay Catholic opinion, published arguing for the morality of nuclear deterrence. And of course, my colleague Jerry Powers, who's closer to the Pope, took me to task in a rebuttal on it. But my basic argument was very similar to the argument that the French and German bishops made during the Cold War, which is there's a difference between deterrence and nuclear use. And that I advocate nuclear deterrence. I believe nuclear deterrence is robust, and I would hope that it will never be tested. Now, I get a little bit nervous when I hear people who argue that we can think about using nuclear weapons in a just war framework if we don't target populations, but rather we target the other side's weapons. I don't buy that distinction. The evidence is pretty much overwhelming that a major counterforce strike against Russia, for example, or China would inevitably involve significant civilian casualties. Worse, it's not clear that if we attack just the strategic systems of those two nuclear powers, that they would restrict their retaliation just against our own system. So the whole idea of fighting nuclear war, I think, pushes the bounds of just war theory further than I think it should go. And that's why I emphasize nuclear deterrence.
Well, so two things. I'm going to follow up on this, but I want to implore all of you, think of your questions. If you have a question, think of how to make it as concise as possible so we can get to as many as possible. But I want to come to a couple more questions here. Isn't there a difference, though, between collateral damage and directly targeting civilians? Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the collateral damage argument was pretty weak. We were trying to wipe out cities. But if we do use a nuclear strike against forces and it creates collateral damage, well, that's always been part of war. And so isn't it sort of in a different moral category than a nuclear attack on non-military forces?
I think the biggest problem for the project of Catholic realism that I'm trying to reinvigorate, I'm not laying it out, I think it's there in the tradition, is precisely the question of intentionality, because a lot of realism is about unintended consequences.
Yep.
Or the salutary consequences of behavior that in an individual would not be particularly praiseworthy. Nonetheless, I think it makes a big difference how many people are killed. And I'm persuaded that a nuclear exchange between even relatively small nuclear powers would be catastrophic for the people involved, and if it was the United States and Russia, for a lot of the world. And whether people intended only to limit an exchange to the military forces of each side is immaterial, because I think the evidence is overwhelming that would be impossible to do, even with the purest of intentions. And so I have problems with the intentionality argument.
Yeah, I think that the question here is about proportionality, right? Yes, collateral damage is a reality in warfare, always has been, and it is with every weapon system. Nuclear weapons are not different in that sense. And you have to ask yourself, is the good you're trying to achieve with a nuclear weapon worth the larger collateral damage that will likely result from it? You mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, 250,000 civilians dead, but it also ended the greatest war in all history. So that's a hard call. I don't actually know what I think on that yet, but I don't think it's easy to dismiss just because it killed a lot of civilians. The effect it achieved was good. It affected a good effect. Right?
I mean, and again, in Christian ethics, in Catholic teaching, the idea that you can commit an objectively evil act to accomplish a good end is not something that the Catholic Church at all, in general, has smiled upon. Lots of Catholic scholars have supported the nuclear.
But I wouldn't.
Japan.
I wouldn't characterize it as what did you still call it, objectively evil act. I just wouldn't characterize it that way. If it's an act of war and you're trying to kill the enemy, and there is known foreseeable collateral damage that's going to happen, I don't call that objectively evil. It's a prudential call about how much collateral damage is going to happen, and we have to use our judgment the best we can.
I have a little bit different take. I mean, I think that the debate about the morality of urban attacks during the Second World War began well before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it did involve a debate, certainly in Europe, between the U.S. Air Force that believed in precision bombing versus the British, who were basically willing to carry the war in the most brutal fashion against German civilians. Now, what happened to us when we shifted the air campaign to the Japanese, I don't know. But we conducted conventional bombing using, basically incendiary bombs with the clear intent of killing large numbers of civilians. And I think that Catholic thinkers like John Ford, a Jesuit, were rightly critical of that. But I don't think that the issue is neatly separable into conventional precise, nuclear, indiscriminate. It's more complicated, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. We have a microphone, and where is the mic right now? So let's start on this side of the room, and we'll progressively make our way over there. So please wait for the mic, introduce yourself, and make your question sound like a question. Hold the microphone pretty close to your mouth.
Thank you. I'm Nicholas Dumovich. I direct the Intelligence Studies program here at Catholic University. And my question is about the special case of covert action, which is special because it's the implementation of foreign policy initiative of the president in such a way that the hand of the United States is either hidden or we lie about it, plausible denial. Whether and how this is consistent with Christian ethics.
That's a great question. Thank you. Lying, good or bad?
Yeah. So I served in the CIA for a number of years as an analyst, nothing more. So I had
Do you now have
occasion-
to kill all of us?
Yeah,
now
that's
that you
right.
told,
Yeah. Close the doors. So I had some occasion to think on this, study it, and actually get a little bit up close with it to see what it's a bit like. I don't think it's that different from normal foreign policy. Covert action is just foreign policy done in secret, and it doesn't actually have to be done by the CIA. Any agency can do it. So I think the normal rules of morality and ethics and just war theory can apply. If it's just to kill, it certainly is just to lie and steal and spy. So I guess that's the framework I'd use to bring to it. I don't think it's especially troubling when you're trying to do things in secret, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think Aquinas said that it was licit in certain circumstances to lie to an adversary. So I think the doctors of the church, have addressed that issue. I have a former colleague and good friend, Jim Olson, who was a long-term CIA DO guy. And he wrote a very thoughtful book on the morality of covert action, fair play, which I commend to you. I know Jim, and I know the depth of his commitment to reconciling, what he did for the country with his religious faith, and I think that the book is a terrific meditation on the challenges, but also how these sorts of operations can be conducted in a justifiable way.
All right.
Just to piggyback a little bit, I'll go further and say about espionage in general, I would actually make the statement, I think it's probably wrong to spy on our allies. It's a foolish waste of resources, but I think it's actually intrinsically wrong. If you've made a partnership with another country, it is you said it's licit to deceive enemies. I agree with that. Is it licit to deceive your friends? No, I don't think it is. And so I would say it's probably wrong to spend resources on espionage for partner
But we
countries.
kind of do that.
And I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. We shouldn't do it.
Well, and our friends spy on us as well, too. I mean, well, first of all, Angela Merkel, I'm sure, has traded in her
old cell phone,
cell phone for something a little bit harder. But it's well known that one of our closest allies, the Israelis. Are one of the most aggressive collectors, in terms of...
That doesn't make it right.
And so now that you said the magic word, we're going to spend the whole rest of the time talking about Israel. No, I'm joking. We're going to move down to a question, but I also will say that Catholic University has a Columbus School of Law which produces lawyers. So if you're worried about professionally lying, the spies in this room are not in the biggest trouble here. So yes.
I'm Charles McLaughlin. I'm a visiting fellow here, and I work for the government too. So, for the sake of the recording, this is only my thoughts. It has nothing to do with the government. But for Dr. Miller, I want to challenge you a bit on your thoughts on your defense of the liberal international order, because it seems to me that
We're out of time.
what you're describing is a history, not the current state. And I don't mean the current state because of this administration either. That liberal international order was established when we had 50% of the world's GDP, when we could afford international institutions and multinational banks and other elements of the structure of the international liberal order that were essentially oriented so that we did not get our fair share from them. We paid more than we got in because we believed in how it was going on, but it was also set up at a time when there was the Soviet Union, and we were trying to organize the free world against the Soviet Union. Neither of those conditions exist anymore. And many of those organizations operate in ways that are antithetical to our interests directly. So for instance, the World Bank actively supporting the development of China's Belt and Road, and also funneling American tax dollars to Chinese companies in order to support the projects around the world. So when you're talking about the liberal international order that we ought to have, is it the current one, which I think is a bit of an anachronism and works against us, is structured against us, or is it some future version of an international order that deals for the reality of today?
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a challenging question. The best answer I can give you is what I'm most interested in defending is a liberal international order, right? The idea of it, the aspiration of it, right? That's what I think is almost, so it's obviously true, and right, that's how I think of it. And it is the aspiration that helps us critique ourselves where we are today, and it challenges us to do better, right? Now, are there flaws in the actual existing international order? Absolutely. And it's by looking at the ideal that we can figure out how to get better, how to revise, adapt, where to invest and improve, and where to maybe sometimes divest, right? We didn't talk a whole lot about the Middle East. That's one area where I am in favor of a bit more retrenchment, because I think there's not a whole lot of opportunity to do good there. I don't know about the World Bank thing, so maybe that's an institution that we should step back from if it really is working against our interests. But my argument, what I'm most keen on is holding out the ideal as our pole star to guide our actions, and that way we would know what to do in the particular cases.
So you had asked me a question at the beginning. I was going to wait till the end, but now I'm going to hop the queue on this about the system that the United States has had over the past 75 years, which I think almost everybody would say was appropriate for the Cold War and played some role in the happy outcome of the Cold War itself. But again, the Cold War is over, and we live in a new world. You sort of have an image, I don't want to caricature this, but for the sake of poetic license, I will, of the recreation of the Bretton Woods system, maybe the European Union, maybe NATO, all of these pillars that I'll admit at a certain period of time were, did good and contributed to peace and stability. But there's sort of and I thought Charles's question sort of hit this right on the nail. The liberal order also has become both tired and in a way less relevant to the world that we're living in today. And so as an exercise in nostalgia, it makes sense. But in terms of being able to recreate the Bretton Woods moment, the EU moment, the UN moment, whatever your favorite moment was of the Cold War liberal order today, sort of stretches the credibility that we could really actually do that in this world that we live in. Be nice if we could, but every time you see, every year at Davos, the disconnect between Davos man and the rest of the world becomes more and more apparent. And I don't think that that's something that we can just recreate. And I also think that Davos man is somewhat complicit in the fact that he or Davos women are no more relevant, or no longer as relevant.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes or no?
If you got something to say it. That was kind of towards you. He addressed your question of the last 75 years.
So I don't think that the liberal order existed only as a tool of containment. Right? In 1950, when Paul Nitze wrote NSC 68, he actually wrote in there, he said, we would do this anyway, even if there were no Soviet Union and no Cold War. We would build these institutions and build this liberal order, because this is good. Right? The liberal order, I think, is intrinsically just, separate from the particular world circumstances it happens to serve.
Because?
Right? Because of the ideals, because of its fairness, because of its equality. It is a good system for ordered liberty among nations. Right? It is ordered liberty among nations implemented in particular institutions. And that's justice itself. However, I will also say it's instrumentally good in the 21st century, Cold War is over, but we have a great power competition. We have Russia, China, and also North Korea, Iran. The liberal order today is a pretty good tool for handling those threats as well. So I'm saying both intrinsically just by its ideals and instrumentally good because of the challenges we face today.
All right, we're going to keep moving down this way in the aisle here. Sorry, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but
I'll talk even faster.
Hello, my name is Will Bartow. I'm a student here at Catholic U. I have a question for the man at the end. So you said that giving more foreign aid and having a greater influence around the world is not imperialist on the U.S.'s part. However, as we see China greatly expanding its influence in places like Africa in particular, where a lot of the countries there are indebted to China, and as such, China has the greater influence in organizations such as the UN. How would the U.S.'s, or in additionally, influence of the other countries around the world be unlike that of what China is doing currently?
How are we different from China?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and from the question of Christian, like we're all Americans, we can be like, yeah, we're the good guys,
Yeah.
but from Christian teaching, to what extent are we different in our foreign aid, in using foreign aid to advance our own interests? Why is that not just selfish in the same way China's is?
Well, I mean, earlier this evening, Mike, you said that you believe in American exceptionalism, and that on the balance we've been more good than bad. We've been a force for good in the world. I think that's generally what my answer is going to be, is that because of the liberal ideals that inform the American experiment, because of the story we tell ourselves about the good guys we want to be, even though we often fall short, those ideals inform the way we interact with the world when we do it best. Right? Obviously, we fail, we're hypocrites sometimes, but when we do it best, our actions around the world, how we treat other countries, is informed by those liberal ideals of equality and fairness, and that's what makes us different from Russia and China and other powers. You know, that's why the liberal order buys its own new stakeholders. Other countries, look, Germany and Japan were avowed enemies and fascists and imperialists in 1945, and now look where they are today. That's the logic of liberal order building, is it builds new allies, new stakeholders.
So let me ask you a question. So I got to know former President George H.W. Bush pretty well, and he was a big fan, as many sort of Republicans were in the 80s and early 90s, of trying to engage China in the major institutions of the liberal international order, the WTO. But there was also, I think, an assumption based on good big L liberal reasoning that China could be made into a stakeholder. And I think there was a good faith effort by these folks that failed. And why it failed, I think, is important to think about in terms of our ability to preserve the liberal international order and bring about a lot of these good things that I wish would come about. We tried with China, and it failed. We tried with Russia, although I think our expansion of NATO worked at cross purposes with some of the other things that we did. We've tried this, and it's run aground. So how can you... It doesn't work, or it hasn't worked in two big cases, and it seems to be at cross purposes now with your argument that we've got to treat Russia and China as great power rivals, and the zone of freedom is going to somehow exclude them.
Well, so in the 1990s and actually through today, we've been trying to foster economic liberalization in China without political liberalization. And I agree with you, it was a mistake and it's failed. And it's actually enriched and empowered a strong totalitarian autocratic China that is now the foremost authoritarian power in the world. So I think we're seeing eye to eye on this. When I think of what the map of the liberal order, you can think of sort of overlapping maps. There's the map of political liberalism, map of economic liberalism, maybe the map of international institutions. So it's thicker in some places and thinner in other places. China just barely participates in economic liberalization. It cheats, it steals intellectual property, it does cyber theft all over the place. So it's almost a rogue actor in the economic sphere. So I don't feel the need to treat them with kid gloves or treat them as if they are full stakeholders
Some of the
in
argument I remember from this time was when we trade with them, the argument is, the liberal argument is, countries that trade don't go to war. And
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was the Kantian tripod. There were three elements to it. We believed, classical liberals believed that free trade was inseparable from political democracy or republicanism, and that the argument for engaging China was the belief that they may not be so democratic now, but we're going to enmesh them in the institutions of global governance, and we're going to get them so hooked on free trade that in good liberal fashion, regime change is going to come along inexorably. That's liberalism.
so this doesn't undermine your faith in the idea of the liberal economic order.
Well, because that version of it is ultimately materialist. It says the foundation is economic, and if you just get the economics right, everything else will follow. It's a version of modernization theory. Look, we all know that's wrong.
This is Immanuel Kant. This is German idealism. This is the classic argument for the international liberal order. It has nothing to do with materialism.
But to the extent that it emphasizes economics first and politics later, it is functionally materialistic, and I don't agree with that at all. I think the most important thing here are the ideas, the norms of liberty and equality, the norms of ordered liberty. If that spreads, I think that the rest will follow. I'm making an argument that ideas matter. Ideas have consequences. Ideas are the independent variable, right? That's, I think, the most important thing.
All right, we're going to try to get to a few more questions. Up front here, because she wore the Catholic Youth sweatshirt, she gets the question.
So I wanted to thank all three of you for coming to speak to us today. And I typed my question because I think the answer to it goes deeper than just the answer that will follow from it. And I actually especially want to hear from you, Professor Miller. But with regard to nuclear weapons and assuming the position that America has a moral obligation to be a morally sound superpower in the world because arguably nobody else will, wouldn't you argue that having nuclear weapons is necessary as a safeguard for preventing other evil powers from using them first? And wouldn't you agree that it is necessary to advertise a power that deters other powers from wanting to use their own weapons like Iran?
So if I understand the question, I think the answer is yes, I agree with that. But it all matters how you use those weapons, right? Because once again, it would not be moral for us to use our nuclear weapons for counter-population warfare or in ways that violate discrimination proportionality. That's not worth it, even if it has a deterrent effect on other countries. Ramsey again said, if it's immoral to threaten a thing, if it's immoral to do a thing, it's immoral to threaten it, right? So it's immoral to just bomb and murder civilians, so I'm not going to use my nuclear weapons to threaten that either. But by and large, I think I agree with what you said. It's good for us to have the tools we need, nuclear or not, to deter our enemies and rivals and opponents who want to harm us and harm our world. It's good to deter them.
Now, I'm not sure you agree that if it's wrong to do a thing, it's wrong to threaten it. Do you agree?
No, and this is, I debated John Finnis on precisely this point. I mean, Finnis thinks you can't bluff, that if you threaten to do something, you're basically, saying that you're going to do it no matter what. I guess he never played poker, but that's another matter. But I want to address this young lady's point, because I find myself in the uncomfortable position. On the one hand, I don't advocate nuclear disarmament. I think nuclear weapons have been a force for stability on balance. You had said, maybe you just misspoke, about Iranian weapons. Iran has no nuclear weapons. They may have some nuclear weapons now that the Joint Comprehensive plan of action, the Iran nuclear deal, which we pulled out of, is falling apart. But we have nuclear weapons, the Iranians don't. And I think it's very important when we're thinking about the situation of what a challenge Iran poses to us, that they don't have nuclear weapons. They don't have much of a military at all.
All right, a couple more quick questions. Yes, up here. Yes, sister.
I've been with a lot of young people across this country lately, and they tell me they want a nuclear-free world, and they want to show you that this whole war-making and nuclearism has caused, this major use of fossil fuel, which is the major destruction of the planet. And I'm asking you the question, does Jesus' life mean anything at all to you? I mean, does it mean anything to say, thou shalt not kill? Does it mean anything to you? Love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. Does it mean anything what the Pope says as it relates to the environment, Laudato Si, and nuclear weapons? Does it mean anything to you to be part of building the better world, which all those folks at the UN tried to do when they say every nation should disarm? When they say that's what we're going to work for, I mean, are you going to become part of the younger generation that I'm listening to all the time that tells me a whole different story? I want to know your philosophy. I want to know what you want to do to make the better world. I want to know what you believe as Christianity.
Well, I'm not going to become a younger person, unfortunately. Unless
Peter Thiel takes over.
Yeah, the portrait of Dorian Gray or something like that. Sister, I don't believe in using nuclear weapons. Deterrence is not the use of nuclear weapons.
Threat to kill.
Not the use. That's very important. Secondly, sister, I believe with you that our heavy dependence on fossil fuels is imposing great harm on the environment. I also think that one short-term solution to that would be a reinvigoration of civilian nuclear power programs. If you want a carbon-free world relatively quickly, you would be an advocate of building civilian nuclear power. It's sort of open and shut.
Paul.
You've raised the classic case of pacifism, right? The Bible says don't kill, and Jesus says love your enemies. That's true. The Bible also says in Romans 13 that God has ordained that government exist and given it a sword so that the wrongdoer would fear it. Right? That is violent imagery, and it's clear that God, look in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, he says to Noah, he who sheds the blood of man by man will his blood be shed. By man will his blood be shed. God is commissioning humanity to keep order in the world. And what mechanism do we have to do that but government, which wields coercive force? So we do have to do that sometimes. Regrettably, we don't live in the city of God. We live in the city of man, where sometimes these things are necessary.
All right. Now everybody raises their hand. Sorry, it's Professor Rin over there.
I'm Klaus Rin, the director of CSS. I associate Christianity with uncompromising realism. You must not have any illusions about human nature. You must have modest expectations. Now back to 2004. On the occasion of the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, David Brooks wrote a column in the New York Times in which he confessed that he had given in to what he called childish illusions as to what was possible in Iraq. And National Public Radio put on a program with people who represented the kind of mindset that got us into the war in Iraq. They had David Brooks, they had Mitch Decter, and of course, Bill Kristol. And they were discussing their second thoughts. Now, what I want to ask you about is, how could it be that this great country would be represented in foreign policy by people like that? Kristol, Decter, Brooks, they were not literally making foreign policy, but people like them were. And who were they? They were people who had to learn elementary lessons, really basic elementary lessons on the job. That is, it took them by surprise that things turned out so disastrously as they did in Iraq. What is the problem here?
And this will be the final question, so sneak in your final statements to that.
So one of my favorite Catholic writers is Graham Greene. And one of my favorite Graham Greene novels was The Quiet American. And one of my favorite characters in that novel was Alden Pyle. Alden Pyle was a good and decent American. He believed in progress, and he believed that advancing America's interest and doing good were not in tension with each other, that they were mutually reinforcing. The tragedy of Vietnam was not that evil people, for self-interested or other reasons, pushed bad policies. The tragedy of Vietnam, the tragedy of Iraq, the tragedy of Libya is that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. And I think an Augustinian view would alert us to that possibility. And I'm not sure that we still have that sort of realistic view of the world.
The greatest tragedy of the war in Iraq will be if we use it as an excuse to lay aside all of our idealism. That will be the greatest casualty of the war. You said that we have to have modest expectations, but did the abolitionists have modest expectations? Did the civil rights movement have modest expectations when they envisioned a world that literally did not exist? No, they used their ideas to envision something better and challenge themselves and challenge the world around them for something better. Yes, we have to have a grounded, realistic appraisal of human sinfulness, but that is not the whole story, not even for Christians. We understand that all humans are made in the image of God, and thereby we have the capacity for goodness, truth, and beauty. And that's the world we have to imagine if we're ever going to live in a better world. Reinhold Niebuhr said, "Nothing that is worth achieving can be accomplished in our lifetimes, and that is why we have to be saved by hope."
Thank you very much. Pax Vobiscum.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.